It's Adam here for PC Monitors, and in this video I'm going to be taking a look at the OSD on-screen display menu system of the AOC PD27. The OSD is controlled either by a joystick at the rear of the monitor, and that has a little rubberized texture, so it has quite a nice feel to it. Alternatively, you can use this little wireless infrared gaming remote, and that can be just neatly placed beneath the monitor. That's kind of you can see from the design, it's really designed to sit there. It goes with the lines of the stand base. But if you need to, you can actually use it from quite a distance from the monitor, just like a TV remote. This little remote has a nice finish to it. This shiny element there, it's not plastic, it's actually metal, so it has a nice solid weight to it, a nice premium feel as well. One thing I would say though is that the design, although it's nice, and I completely see where they've gone with it, with keeping with the lines of the stands and all of that, I would say that it's a little bit of form over function going on here, because it's quite a tippy design, especially when you press the up button there. So you have to sort of stabilize it with your fingers and then use it like that. Obviously that's fairly easy to do and something you get used to, but it would be nice not having to do that. But the directional arrows there and the little bit in the middle there, that gives you the same functionality as the joystick. So if you press that, it's like pressing the joystick, and then there's left, right, up and down. There's 1, 2 and 3, which allows you to activate the Gamer 1, Gamer 2 and Gamer 3 presets, which I'll come on to shortly, and there's a back button as well. The only additional functionality that you have with the joystick that you don't have with this remote is that it also acts as the power button, so there isn't a separate power button on this model. If you hold the joystick in for, I think it's around 5 seconds, it will power down the monitor. Alternatively, if the monitor's lost a signal, and that means that this little power LED, you can see it's white at the moment, if that glows orange, it means that the monitor is in a low power state, so it's lost signal to the system. You just have to press the joystick briefly and it will turn off. If you press the left arrow, or indeed twiddle the joystick left, you can change the game mode used by the monitor, and I'll come on to them when I get to them in the main menu system. But there's off, FPS, RTS, racing, Gamer 1, Gamer 2, Gamer 3, and off, which is my preferred setting. If you press the joystick up, or press the up arrow, you can quickly select the input used by the monitor. Right will allow you to control the LightFX feature, or some of the LightFX functionality, and again I'll come on to that when I get to it in the main menu system. If you press down, you get this little on-screen crosshair. I think it's called dial point on AOC monitors. You can see it just near the leopard's nose there. So that's just when you press the down arrow. So if you see this on the screen and you don't know what it is and you don't want it there, just press the down arrow and it'll disappear. Press the joystick in and that gets you to the main menu system. You can see that the layout is quite interesting, quite different to your usual AOC style. And AOC has had their same style since, I think it's 2011. So it's nice to see a bit of variety here. Some of their Aegon models, this is an Aegon model, but some of their Aegon models have a different layout as well, which is slightly different, but I haven't seen this kind of collage of blocks design before. So the first thing there, OSD setup. That allows you to change the language that the OSD is displayed in. There is a timeout period, so that's how long after the last button press before the OSD will automatically disappear. And you can set that between, I think it's 5 and 120 seconds. Yep, 5 and 120 seconds. So if you're a complete ninja, you can have it set to 5 seconds. If you're recording a video all about the OSD like I am, it's better to have that set to something higher. DP capability, so for the full feature set, you want to have that set to 1.2/1.4 as it says there, but for compatibility, you can set that to 1.1 if you need to, if you're using an older GPU. You can change the horizontal position of the OSD on the screen. In fact, I'll just keep it centrally just so it looks a little bit nicer on the video, why not? There's transparent, so you can change the transparency effect of the OSD. I'm quite happy with the default of 25, so I'll just leave that. There's a break reminder feature, and that'll put a message on the screen when you've been using the monitor for an hour to say that you might want to take a break. Then if you press any button, it'll just get rid of the reminder. Next, there's extra. So that has input select, so it's set to automatic at the moment, but if you would like to, you can manually select an input used by the monitor instead. there's a logo projector feature. I'll just show you that quickly. Now this is separate to the LightFX feature, and actually it's a bit easier to show you if I turn the LightFX feature off. I will come on to the LightFX feature shortly. But the logo projector is a separate feature, and what that does is it projects either a Porsche design or an Aegon logo onto the desk beneath the monitor if you have the feature enabled. So if I turn this on, you can have it set to low. You can see it's the Porsche design at the moment. I'll show you how you select the logo in a second. You can have it set to low, medium or strong. And actually, if you want it to be even brighter, you can see this is set to red 50, green 50 and blue 50. If you set that to 100 for everything, it'll actually be even brighter. But you can see I've now set it to a sort of very warm white, or reddish white if you prefer. So you can customize the RGB completely if you want a different color. But if you want it to be very bright, you set it like that, everything to 100, and it's super solid. It basically looks like it's painted onto the desk. It's quite impressive actually. But if you wanted it to be completely cyan, for example, you could do that. But you get the idea. Complete RGB functionality there, so it's quite nice for the customization. I'm just going to set it to blue and then show you the Aegon design instead. So you can see there now it's a nice deep dark blue. So the logo projector is actually right at the bottom of the stand there. A little bit difficult to focus on with the camera, but there's a little switch there, and that's how you change the lens used for the projector. So you just kind of slide that little switch to the left or right, and if you switch it to the left as I've done now, it turns this to an Aegon logo. And just to show you the switching process, to show you what it does, it's basically a disc with two different lens designs on. So that's how it shifts between the two. And it's also worth bearing in mind that this isn't a dim room. I've just shown you how bright this can go, and this room's actually quite bright at the moment, and you can still see that logo very solidly. So if you like that kind of feature, it is quite a good implementation. I'm not really too fussed about it myself. I kind of like the LightFX feature, and I'll come on to that shortly, but the logo I'm not really too bothered about. Next, there's off timer, and that will allow the monitor to turn off after a given amount of time has elapsed in hours. You can set that between 1 and 24 hours, or if you set it to 0, it means the feature is disabled. There's an image ratio setting that applies when you're running a non-native resolution. You also need adaptive sync disabled to use this. So I'm just going to disable adaptive sync, and then I'm going to switch to the non-native full HD resolution so I can show you this feature. So to use this feature, you have to have adaptive sync disabled, and you have to have one of the resolutions from this list. I appreciate not everyone's going to be using NVIDIA control panel, but this is just to show you how the resolutions are organized on this. So the monitor can use interpolation or a scaling process for all of these resolutions and refresh rates in this first list, which NVIDIA calls Ultra HD, HD, SD. So you can see you can do it up to 120 Hz here, full HD, various other resolutions as well. Now that feature should be available to me in extra. So you can see there, image ratio, it's set to wide, that's the default. That means the interpolation process is used, all of the pixels of the monitor are lit up doing something. The next setting along is 1:1, so that's a 1:1 pixel mapping feature. So it's only using the pixels called for in the source resolution. And it gives a nice black border, or not so nice black border, depending on your opinion on that, around the rest of the image. So it's completely undistorted full HD image there, but it's quite a small section of the screen. The remaining settings here are essentially emulations of different screen sizes and aspect ratios. So there's 17-inch 4:3, and these would make more sense if you're using the same aspect ratio as what you're selecting here, if you wanted to simulate a particular screen size and aspect ratio. So you can see because this is now 19-inch 4:3, everything's squished up because my resolution is a 16:9 resolution full HD. But there are various different settings here. There's also 19-inch 5:4, 19-inch 16:10, 21.5-inch 16:9, so you can see it isn't crushed up anymore, and it's simulating a 21.5-inch screen size of the same ratio as the resolution I'm currently using. 22-inch 16:10, 23-inch 16:9, 23.6 inch 16 by 9, 24 inch 16 by 9, and back to the default wide setting. Next there's DDC/CI, and that allows you to use software to control the monitor, such as AOC's G menu, which I'll show you at the end of this video. Reset, which will reset everything to the factory defaults, and it also shows you the current resolution, horizontal frequency and vertical frequency, with the V frequency being the more interesting one there, the more applicable one. So this is how you would tell if the monitor is handling the scaling if you're using a non-native resolution, or if it's just the GPU using scaling instead. Because if the resolution says 2560 by 1440 and you're running a non-native resolution, it means it's the GPU doing the scaling. Whereas if this matches the resolution you've selected, it means the monitor is doing the scaling. And if you've got adaptive sync active, it just says adaptive sync there for V frequency rather than showing a particular refresh rate. I've dimmed the lights for this next bit. Very exciting stuff coming up. LightFX. So there are two sets of LEDs on this monitor. I'm just going to set this to strong. Actually, I'll set it to low because I'll probably capture it a bit better on the camera if I do that. So there's some LEDs at the bottom of the monitor. I've counted them and I've put how many there are in the written review in the features and aesthetics section. But you can see there's quite a decent strip of them there, quite a long strip. And at the back of the monitor as well, there are some here. I'm just going to decrease my camera's exposure. Still a bit tricky to see them, but you can see, perhaps you can see now, there are some distinct LEDs there. So they go up at the top there. There's also some to the left, some to the right, and again I've counted these and you can see how many I counted in the written review. But these actually face towards the rear of the monitor, so they actually illuminate the rear of the monitor. They don't face backwards. So it doesn't give you a nice pool of light around the monitor. It doesn't give you an aura or anything like that. It can't be used as a strong bias light feature or any real bias light feature. So I've got this set to strong now, and you can definitely see light behind the monitor. There's also some to the sides, but there isn't really a nice field of light behind the monitor and around the monitor. And again, you can see it to the sides, but it's not the same as having a nice strong field of light behind the monitor, which can really enhance perceived contrast and act as a bias light. But you can certainly still appreciate it from the front because of the quite powerful LEDs on the bottom. So I've shown you there, you can select low, medium or strong. That's just how bright the LEDs are. There are different LightFX modes. I prefer static. I'm not going to spend too long going through the other ones. They just do various different animation patterns really. And the pattern you can set to, that's really the colour rather than the pattern, but you can set that to user define, which I had set before. You can set the red, green and blue colour channels there. So I had it set to 100, 40 and 20, and that gives a warm white glow, which I find quite restful when the room is darker. And I quite like having it on actually quite a lot of the time, especially in these winter months where there's not a lot of natural light coming into the room. But everyone will have their own preferences and you can do your own thing there. So you could have it set to a nice kind of pink colour or purple, whatever you want. So you can see there's just a huge amount of customization because you get full RGB control. I really like that. Like being able to have that level of customization, but I would have liked there to have been a stronger aura behind the monitor. You can see now, you can see a little bit around the monitor. I'm not sure how the camera is going to be capturing this on the video, but it really isn't a strong enough field of light to be considered a bias light or anything like that. So the other patterns, there's also red, green, and there's blue. LightFX mode static, which as I said is my preferred one. There's simple shift, which just does this kind of thing. Gradient shift. Sorry if I sound a little bit unenthusiastic at the moment. I find it a bit gimmicky, these different shifting patterns and these animations, but I suppose some people might like them. One-way filling. Two-way filling. Breathing. And again, with any of these patterns, you can change the red, green and blue colour channels to suit, or just select red, green or blue if you prefer. Motion point. So just to show you what the LEDs are doing. You You can see there's a little bit of a dancing going on there. The LEDs also reflect quite nicely off the shiny stand. You can see there the shiny metal stand. There's zoom, which is another pattern. And it's not just at the bottom, it is doing it at the back as well, but that's not really particularly interesting to show you because you'd have to be around the rear of the monitor to see that. Disk color, perhaps more interesting setting to some people. It just cycles various different shades. I'll just show you around the back now. So again, you can see that that's really just lighting up the rear of the monitor rather than the wall. There is still some light hitting the wall, mainly from the powerful LEDs at the bottom there. Water wave. Not entirely sure what that's doing. Okay, fair enough. Flashing, fairly self-explanatory that one. Demo, which just cycles through various different effects. And there's audio. So you can see that's just pulsing at the moment. But if you've got audio passing through the monitor, and it does have to be passing through the monitor, incidentally, because otherwise it doesn't know what is happening with the signal. So it does need to intercept it, so to speak. So to make sure I don't have a copyright strike or anything like that, I'm just using my own content, so no one can complain about copyright except for me. I'm not going to complain to myself because I really don't care. Saturated. Crushes things together, you lose shade variety. With a wide gamut. You can see it's just flashing in exactly the same way. I'm not sure why it's not responding to the audio there. Perhaps I need to go out of the menu system. I've set it to green as well, just for a little bit of variety, but now you can see it, okay. In this case, things maintain variety, they maintain appropriate spacing on the gamut, but it certainly makes things look more saturated than they should, or the developers in. Yeah, I've had enough of that. It's just really intense flashing. It's I don't really see the point in that, to be honest. And just a final thing to mention, if you're using some of these LightFX modes, then you can also see foreground red, green and blue, so you've got more customization over what's happening. So this motion point there, you can select what's happening with the little cluster of LEDs that's moving around as well as the rest of them. So you can customize them separately if you like. And there's also another pattern that's sometimes available for some of these, rainbow. So again, that's cycling various different shades. You'll be able to see that now. But as I said, I'm simple. I like to have it set to static and something which gives a kind of warmish white glow down there. Next, you've got audio. So you can configure the integrated speakers or anything connected to the 3.5mm jack, but this is really mainly for the integrated speakers. So there's DTS sound. You can change the volume as well, but DTS sound, that's the technology that the speakers use. You can set that to various different presets: rock, classical, live, theatre, off or game. If you have it set to off, then you can customize the equalizer settings yourself. So there's quite good flexibility there. Everyone will have their own preferences here. I quite like the rock setting. As far as integrated speakers go, these monitor speakers are quite good. There's also True Volume HD, which will just equalize the volume and stop it so that very loud elements become super loud and very quiet elements are super quiet, that kind of thing. But yeah, as I was saying, these speakers are quite decent for integrated monitor speakers. I mean, they're not amazing. For example, I don't like using them for gaming because they're not directional. I much prefer a good set of headphones for that kind of thing. For listening to music, they're not super bassy, they're not super amazing or anything like that, but they're a lot better than most integrated monitor speakers, so they're quite usable. I talk a little bit more about them in the written review as well. Boot sound, this is something which most people are going to want to turn off straight away. It's on by default. And what this does, I will show you. I'll turn it on, and this is very much the last time that I'm going to have this on, I can assure you of that. If I then turn the monitor off, and then on again, it makes a strange noise, which is actually quite loud, and the first time I ever heard that, I didn't know what on earth it was. So just, I honestly got no idea why you'd want the monitor to do that every time you turn it on. So before I forget, I'm going to turn that off right now. Next is color setup. This allows you to adjust the low blue mode, the low blue light setting of the monitor. There's off, multimedia, internet, office and reading. Reading's the strongest and then they're progressively weaker if you go the other way. So I use the reading mode for my own viewing comfort in the evenings, but not for specific testing of the monitor, except for when I'm talking about this particular setting. So it is very effective at cutting the strength of the blue color channel and reducing blue light output from the monitor. It's even more effective if you reduce the brightness, and you can do that. It doesn't lock off your brightness control or anything like that. So it's quite an effective low blue light setting. As is often the case, it does give a bit of a green tint as well as giving a warm tint to the image. So the green tint is because it doesn't massively reduce the green color channel. It maintains quite a strong green color channel, and that's because reducing the green color channel has a significant or potentially significant effect on contrast. So that's why they do that. But I find it quite fine. My eyes adjust to it fairly readily when I've got this enabled, so I'm quite happy to use that myself in the evenings. There's color temp, so if you set that to user, you can control the red, green and blue color channels down here. Warm is the factory defaults. Normal, which is just slightly different to warm, I think. It's a very subtle difference actually. I think it is perhaps not quite as warm, but it's still fairly warm overall, on my unit at least. Cool, which gives a high white point, so a cool look to the image. sRGB, this is an sRGB emulation setting. Just be aware, and I do talk about this in the review, that you now have your luminance menu locked off, so you can't adjust the contrast, or more importantly, you can't adjust the brightness. You can't adjust the gamma mode either. And then back to user. DCB mode, dynamic color boost. So this is a digital saturation enhancement which pulls shades towards the edge of the gamut without expanding the gamut itself, so you lose shade variety, but it helps highlight certain shades. So there's full enhance, which kind of oversaturates most shades really. Nature skin, which concentrates more on your reddish tones. So on the sunflower, it actually enhances the yellows and oranges as well. So shades containing red. Green field, which focuses more on those green shades. Sky blue, which focuses more on the blue shades. Auto detect, which is supposed to look at the content and then change based on that. I think most of the time it looks quite similar to full enhance when you use that though. I prefer to leave this off for a more natural look to the image with superior shade variety. There's DCB demo, and that's supposed to give you a split screen showing the feature enabled versus disabled. Next you've got image setup. This allows you to change the HDR mode. This is really mostly applicable when you actually have an HDR color signal in use, but when you don't, this does make some changes to the image. There's HDR picture. This enhances the saturation, a bit like the digital saturation boost I talked about before with the DCB, but this one doesn't crush the shade variety as much for the boost of saturation it gives you, because it also targets the gamma curves rather than just pulling things closer to the edge of the gamut. I don't like the look though, it looks quite garish and unnatural, so I mean some people might like it, that's why you can select these if you want. HDR movie, which has an even stronger effect it looks like. And HDR game, which is stronger again in terms of its saturation boost. Or perhaps it just has a slightly different gamma enhancement effect. So you can hopefully see some differences with the sunflower there. You won't be able to see the exact nature of the differences, but off is really more how things should look. And if you select one of these, I don't really like to call these HDR emulation settings because there's really no such thing. You either have HDR or you don't. There's really no in between. It's just a strange filter. So again, some people might like to use this, but it's really when you've got HDR active where this applies. So I'm just going to activate HDR. Now I'm running HDR, you'll see that some things are grayed out. You can't access the luminance menu. You can't access color setup either. But image setup, which I was on just before, you can. So it will default to display HDR, which is my preferred HDR setting when you actually have an HDR color signal. There's HDR picture, and this gives intense oversaturation. Again, I'm not necessarily going to be able to see this on the video, but that sunflower looks hideous now, quite frankly. The desktop icons look completely wrong. It just looks quite horrible. It also has this strange sharpness filter applied, which I don't much like. HDR movie, it's more of the same, but it seems to have a stronger sharpness filter, if anything. And these are just my initial impressions as I'm cycling through these right now, but to my eye, immediately it looks really quite horrible. I did test them under HDR and actually have looked at proper HDR game content with these as well, and I didn't really think much of them at all there. HDR game, that again has this intense oversaturation. It looks really unnatural, but it at least takes off or very much reduces that sharpness filter. Or you can have HDR off, and if you do that when you've got an HDR color signal, things look extremely washed out and extremely flooded. So again, display HDR, the default setting, is my preferred one there. Next up you've got luminance, and that allows you to change the contrast and brightness used by the monitor. You can change the eco mode, and what this does, or the main thing this does, is it just gives a preset brightness to various different levels. So text's quite dim, it's actually just similar to what I was using before. Internet, game, movie and sports are getting progressively brighter. There's nothing that you couldn't achieve yourself by just changing the brightness manually. You just have less control when you activate these settings. Reading is the one that's a bit different because that makes everything grayscale, and you can actually adjust the brightness when you've got the reading mode enabled. There are 3 different gamma modes as well, gamma 1, gamma 2 and gamma 3. And you might notice sometimes I accidentally go back in the menu system. That's because I'm used to having to press the joystick or press enter to actually cycle through the settings or select the setting. But on this one you don't do that. You just highlight the setting and then press left or right to cycle through them. So there's gamma 1, gamma 2, gamma 3. They're explored in the written review. DCR, dynamic contrast ratio, also explored in the written review. And finally here there are game settings, or game setting as they call them here. Different game modes. So I'm only going to go through these briefly because, as I mentioned before, I really don't like these. All they do is they upset the image. So FPS, massively oversaturated. You have lots of things locked off. So you can see lots of this menu has been locked off. And if you go to color setup, you'll see you can't change that either. You can activate the low blue mode, but you can't change the red, green and blue color channels yourself or anything like that. There's RTS, which is a bit different, but more of the same really. Racing, again, just really upsets the image and actually brings out some shades in a very weird way. Gamer 1, Gamer 2 and Gamer 3. I don't actually like these either, unfortunately. And I say unfortunately because I would prefer if they were fully customizable and you could just select everything yourself, set everything up as you wish, but that isn't what they do. You'll find that if you go to color setup now, again, you can't change the red, green and blue color channels. There's some clear oversaturation as well with these gamer settings. You can't control MBR, motion blur reduction, which I'm going to show you very shortly. So they're just too restrictive. And if you recall, there's the 1, 2 and 3 buttons on the OSD remote, and they just cycle between these settings. But because I would never use them, and I don't think many users would really see much appeal to using them, that's basically 3 wasted buttons on the remote. It'd be much better if you could fully customize these settings, or at least you could set those 1, 2 and 3 buttons to something else and customize the functionality. Otherwise it's really just a waste of space. There's shadow control. I usually would show you legom.nl, but you can actually see the effects very clearly on the desktop background here, and that's not a good thing because what shadow control is supposed to do, it's basically like a black equalizer setting or a gamma enhancement setting. It lightens up dark shades so things are more visible, and it does do that to its credit, but it also lightens up every other area of the image as well, so things become completely flooded. And it also raises the black point, so even when you go up from 50, which is a default, to 60, the contrast is massively reduced because the black point is significantly raised. If you decrease this, then it gives a more cinematic look, makes things look very deep, very dark. But it's really not a very granular control of this, and it affects too much of the image for me to recommend using it, or for me to consider it as good as some other implementations. There's game color, and this is another way to enhance the saturation. And this one, again, pulls things closer to the edge of the gamut without expanding the gamut itself. Even at 11, I see significant oversaturation. And this monitor has a generous color gamut anyway, so that is a better way of achieving the extra saturation without upsetting the shade variety. So even if you've got this set to 10, I think most users are going to find it pretty vibrant anyway. But if you want to, and you really have to, then you can change this. It's a bit like NVIDIA's digital vibrance control, but it's a monitor side version of that setting. If you reduce it, you can take a bit of edge off the saturation. I find that some shades are really a lot less saturated than you might want, whereas others remain quite saturated, so it's very difficult to get the balance right. There's MBR, and I have to give you a flicker warning now because the screen is going to flicker when I activate this, because that's what it does. It's a strobe backlight setting. So you can set this as long as adaptive sync is off, because you can't use this at the same time as adaptive sync. It's between 0, which is off, or between 1 and 20. And this becomes your brightness control with MBR. So when you've got MBR active, as I do now, you can't adjust the brightness because that is your brightness control. More specifically, it changes the pulse width, or the length of the strobe if you prefer. So it's really a trade-off between brightness and potential motion clarity. What I would say though is that up to a point it kind of does improve the motion clarity, perhaps up to 10 or so. I can't really remember off the top of my head, but if you go much beyond, let's just say 10, it really just has a noticeable effect on dimming the screen without giving you an edge in motion clarity or a further edge in motion clarity. So I tend to set it to 15, which gives me a similar brightness to what I would be using outside of NBR. Having said that, I don't actually really use the NBR setting myself, and I explore this in the written review and the video review, and you'll see why it sort of has its pros and cons, and you have to weigh them up for yourself. Also to mention the overdrive setting, just before I get to adaptive sync, the overdrive can be set to off, weak, medium, strong, or boost. Now what boost does, it isn't clear because it doesn't really show you that's what it's doing, but what it actually does is it sets MBR to 20, which is the highest value, the strongest MBR setting, the dimmest MBR setting as well, and it sets the overdrive as if it's set to off, which is a very strange combination. I don't know why you'd want to do that. It really doesn't work very well. But my preferred setting for overdrive is medium, but if you're using MBR and you're set to 240 Hz, with MBR, I would actually recommend the strong setting. And again, I talk about this in the review, and you can activate MBR at any refresh rate that's 120 Hz or above on this model. So you can see that you do retain overdrive control when you've got MBR active. If you activate adaptive sync, it means you can use AMD FreeSync as an AMD GPU or system user, and you can use NVIDIA's G-Sync compatible mode if you've got a compatible NVIDIA GPU. And as you can see now, MBR is grayed out, you can't use them at the same time. And you'll also see that the overdrive goes up to strong, but there isn't the boost setting. That's because you can't activate MBR with adaptive sync at the same time. There's low input lag. You'll notice that that is also grayed out when you've got adaptive sync on. That's because it just forces it to the on state when you're using adaptive sync, so you don't have to worry about the setting. It's on, nothing to worry about there. But if you want to disable this for any reason and you're not using adaptive sync, you can do that. I don't see a reason to do this. It doesn't have any negative implications that I could see, and it does seem to reduce the input lag somewhat, so just leave it enabled. Or if you're using adaptive sync, don't worry about it. It'll be automatically enabled for you anyway. There's a setting they call frame counter, and to use this you need to have adaptive sync active because it actually just shows you the refresh rate that the monitor is running at. You can set that to right up, right down, or left up, depending on the location you want to have the information displayed. So I'm going to just select left up. You'll see towards the top left there, it says 240 in red there. So I've now got NVIDIA's pendulum demo running, and you'll be able to see this changing along with the frame rate. So I've got the frame rate set to min 120, max 240. And you'll see that that's bouncing around between those values. And the actual frame rate of the content is displayed there. So this is an indication that adaptive sync's enabled, and adaptive sync is doing its thing to adjust the refresh rate to try and match the frame rate of the content. If you have adaptive sync disabled, that's just going to give you the static refresh rate of the display that you've got selected. And that was the last feature. So I'm now going to open AOC G menu and just give you a quick run through of that. So the main thing this does is it allows you to select various different settings. You can select a different preset, and it allows you to quickly switch between these. When I say quickly, it does take a little bit of time to engage the first time sometimes, but it then responds quite quickly. And you can also press advanced there, and this will open up a few extra settings. So So you can change various different things here. Just be aware that sometimes you might select something like sRGB and it makes it look like you can change the gamma setting, which you can't do when you're under sRGB. As I showed you before, the gamma is actually grayed out, so this doesn't do anything. Brightness as well. It looks like you can change the brightness with this slider, but you actually can't. It doesn't do anything. It always resets it to the default 70 because that's all you can use with the sRGB setting active. Or if you've got this set to user RGB, you can control the red, green and blue color channels. And you'll notice that doesn't always update straight away to reflect the actual brightness because it said 70 when it was actually 20. So just be a little bit aware of these things. They're not always exactly what they're showing. Dial point gets that on-screen crosshair on and off. Frame counter, which I've just shown you. Various other settings as well. There's also an export and import feature if you want to save sets of settings and import them later. Next is game sync, and that just allows you to change to a different preset mode depending on the application you're running. So you have to press enable game sync first, and then you can select one of these presets. Unfortunately, you can't have different custom sets of settings, so you can't have different custom modes with different presets there. It's just these predefined presets, which I really don't much like anyway. It's not a bother for me. I would recommend that you actually just have one set of settings that you're happy to use with all applications. But I know some people do like to use different settings for different applications, and fair enough if they do, but that's just a sort of fairly limited flexibility you get here because of how they've done things. There's also desktop game sync mode, which will mean that when you're on the desktop, it'll select something different versus when you're in a game. There's LightFX, so that's an alternative way of controlling those LightFX LEDs that I showed you earlier. You can again see it's not reporting this properly because it says the feature is off when it's clearly on. However, just press this slider and then it will let you control the LightFX feature. So you can have various different settings there. It's exactly the same functionality as you get in the OSD. It's just an alternative way of changing things. Low blue modes, so you can quickly activate a low blue light setting or deactivate it. Eco modes, you can do the same with eco. It doesn't have the reading setting there, which was the one that makes everything grayscale. Extended eco features as well. So there are a few other settings here. Activate timers. There's an idle timer, so the screen will dim after a given number of minutes that you set here, between 1 and 300, and then a number of minutes you'd select after that here for power timer. The screen would then turn off, so it would go into a low power state, in other words. You can also set the monitor to go on to standby on various different times and various different days. So if you know that you're definitely not going to be using the monitor at 4 PM on Tuesday, for example, you could have it set to turn on to standby then. And finally here there's display. Has various different additional options, so you can have it run at startup, always on top, that kind of thing, various other things. USB charging, I'm not actually sure if that does anything on this unit because there wasn't a setting of that sort on the OSD itself, so that's quite interesting. There are some USB ports on this, and one of them is coloured yellow, and it's supposed to support fast charging. So I'm not sure if this does actually control whether the USB ports can charge devices when the screen enters a low power state. That could possibly be what it does. Sync messaging, that will just give you messages when it does various different things on the screen. You can enable or disable HDR, the HDR mode. It isn't a way to enable an HDR signal. You'd have to do that through Windows or with the in-game toggle. You can change the resolution used by the monitor, the refresh rate, the image select, so that's the ratio settings I showed you before. So I'm using adaptive sync at the moment, so this isn't going to do anything. You can see there, doesn't have any effect, it's because I'm using adaptive sync. But if I wasn't using adaptive sync, I could apply these different settings there, just as I could in the OSD. Line out volume as well, so the volume of the integrated speakers or anything connected to the 3.5mm jack, or you can mute that. Select the input. There are hotkeys as well. So I've gone through this in other videos, so I'm not going to spend too long going through this, but you can, for example, increase or decrease the brightness by using different hotkeys. So you can have Control and A and Control and Z, for example, if you wanted to increase and decrease the brightness. But the application focus does have to be on G menu for this. When you're on the desktop, I think it works just fine. But if you're in a game, you're in a full screen application, then it's not going to be actually working for you. You can also change the volume with these shortcuts or the shadow control feature, or indeed change the mode used by the monitor, so the preset mode. And there's window transparency, which changes the transparency level of the G menu. And when you've got G menu open as well, if you just want to quickly change to a different preset, you can just right click on the desktop and do it like that, or press Tune Display, which will actually open the G menu application. There's also a little system tray icon which has the same kind of functionality. So that's really all there is to the OSD on-screen display menu system of the AOC PD27. Be sure to check out the full review on pcmonitors.info. There's a link to that in the description of the video, alongside information about how you can support the work that we do.